This lesson is entitled Crossing the Border. The idea is to understand principles relating to the beginning of the Mexican-American War, with the goal of students being able to use that information to develop pertinent arguments and understanding of present-day issues such as immigration.
In 1845, James K. Polk took office as the 11th President of the United States. He was known as the dark horse candidate, but no one expected him to win. His opponents scoffed at him, asking the question, "Who is James K. Polk?"
When Polk won the election, riding on the tide of manifest destiny, this is the idea promoted by a columnist named John L. O'Sullivan, which said God had given the Americans the right to control the continent from the East Coast to the West Coast. This is a political cartoon that highlights Uncle Sam, the United States, dreaming about being able to control practically the entire Western Hemisphere. It was these principles that drove the Americans in the late 1840s to lead to the Mexican-American War.
This lecture is important because it stimulates discussion and asks the question, who really owns the land between Mexico and the United States? What makes the border between the Americans and the Mexicans legitimate? It helps us to formulate decisions relating to a very hot-button topic, immigration. We used to sing a song in grade school that said, "This land is your land, this land is my land," from California to the New York Islands, from the Gulf Stream waters to the Redwood Forest. This land is made for you and me. Is that really true? Is this land really for you and me, for all of us? And so as we look at the things that stimulate the Mexican-American War, my hope is that you will be able to formulate your own interpretation of what really is fair, what is legitimate as it relates to boundaries, in this case between the United States and Mexico.
America considered the Rio Grande the border between Mexico and the United States. Mexico, however, maintained the Nueces River, 150 miles to the north, was the border. The bloody skirmish on this disputed territory lasted only moments, but long enough for 11 U.S. soldiers to be killed and 52 to be taken prisoner. When word of the attack reached President James Polk, he demanded Congress declare war against the nation he considered the aggressor, Mexico.
He is absolutely lying. He lies about American blood was shed in American territory. The whole declaration is full of lies.
Polk's election 2 years earlier fueled Mexican-American hostility. The core of his campaign was expansion of America's western border to the Pacific. He believed it would fulfill America's manifest destiny.
The idea is that the Americans, in a sense, are God's new chosen people. And He has intended for them to settle North America. It isn't just them going, we would like to have this land, but God intends us to have this land. And so that's a pretty powerful mandate.
Talking about God's plan gives you cover to do what you want. There's no question about that.
The problem was the land Polk coveted was controlled by Mexico. Its northern territories, known as California and New Mexico. When the U.S. Congress voted to annex Texas in February 1845, Mexico broke off diplomatic relations. Mexican authorities threatened to take Texas back by force, but the threat was fueled more by passion than reason.
They knew that we didn't have money, that we didn't have an army, that our armament was very obsolete, and besides that, we were divided.
Claiming that Texas needed protection, Polk sent 1,500 soldiers by steamboat to Corpus Christi. located at the mouth of the Nueces River. Within 4 months, the Army of Observation had grown to 4,000. The troops were commanded by 60-year-old General Zachary Taylor, nicknamed Old Rough and Ready.
One of the things about Zachary Taylor that was often noted was how informal he ran his headquarters and his camp. It didn't mean necessarily that he didn't have discipline in his army, but folks would come into his camp and they would be looking for the general, and they'd see this old man dressed in a kind of a tattered coat and pants, and they would take that person to be a servant, and they'd ask where the general was. And he'd often have a lot of fun because he'd say, oh, he's not here right now. He tended to be kind of like his name, kind of rough, but ready.
Using the intimidating presence of U.S. troops, Polk sent Congressman John Slidell to make Mexico an offer he hoped they wouldn't refuse. $30 million in exchange for Mexico's northern territories, and the agreement that the Rio Grande, not the Nueces, was the border between the two countries. A deal that would result in Mexico giving up nearly half its land.
Polk approached this whole problem confident that if he bullied Mexico enough and gave them enough money, they would sell their land. And that, I think, is a window into the way that Polk thought about Mexicans generally. Essentially, he despised them.
While Slidell waited in Mexico City for an official meeting, Polk instructed him not to push the $30 million proposal if Mexico accepted the Rio Grande as the Texas border. But before any offer could be made, Mexican officials learned that Slidell would be trying to make half their country part of the United States.
Word leaked out that this was this man's intention, and the press starts talking about horrible betrayal. You know, we're not going to have any land left once this thing's over. So it made it impossible for the government to recognize this envoy, and it only deepened the diplomatic crisis.
Mexican officials sent the Polk envoy home. Slidell wrote to the president, "Depend on it. We can never get along with the Mexicans until we have given them a drubbing." Polk quickly ordered Taylor to move his troops south to the Rio Grande, in the disputed territory.
In Polk's rhetoric, this is entirely legitimate because he, after all, is now only in southern Texas. But he knew full well that all Mexicans believed that that was Mexican territory.
By late March 1846, Taylor's troops reached the northern bank of the Rio Grande, where they built an earthen fortress named Fort Texas.
And so in 1846, the United States goes to war. They move into this disputed territory, and the Mexicans respond by shooting and violence. James K. Polk uses that as a justification to call for a declaration of war. He argues that American blood had been shed on American land. The Mexicans, on the other hand, just saw it as nothing but a brute invasion of a stronger power taking advantage of a weaker power. There were some things that kind of lead to this invasion. One of them is that Texas had gained independence from Mexico in 1836, and so the United States wanted to limit the Mexican influence in the state, and part of doing that would be to move the boundary to the Rio Grande River. Also, Polk tried to offer money, $30 million, to purchase the land, but the call for so much of a ceding of their northern provinces made accepting the money almost like a bribe and an insult, and so the Mexicans categorically rejected. And therefore, this war takes place, and ultimately the United States will win. And so questions would rise as to whether or not this was a principled war that was just, or an unprincipled war that was unjust. The next map will give more details about the conflict.
As you can see on the map, the United States invades Mexico and surrounds the country. They also send troops into their northern provinces. The Americans conquer what is today California, New Mexico, Arizona, and so forth. Another event is that in 1847, the United States actually occupies Mexico City, which is the capital. And so there was a question as to whether or not to conquer the entire country. But in the debate, it was decided to let the Rio Grande River be the southern border between the United States and Mexico. The Americans really did not want large numbers of Mexicans as part of their country. As a matter of fact, part of what stimulated the invasion in the first place is the territory or their newly acquired state of Texas. The Americans did not want many Mexicans controlling Texas, and therefore they wanted to make sure that the boundary would be more to the south. So when we consider the hot topic of immigration, questions are asked. What is an illegal immigrant as compared to what is one that is legal? Some will suggest that it is not that the immigrants are crossing the border, but instead, as a consequence of the Mexican-American War, the border crossed them. In the end, the United States wins the Mexican-American War, and it is completed with a treaty signed by Nicholas Treece called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. As a result, the United States receives California, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and even parts of Wyoming. They pay $15 million in exchange to Mexico. And so new questions now arise as to whether or not this territory would be slave or free land. Some, like David Wilmot in the United States Congress, said no slavery should take place in these newly acquired territories, while Lewis Cass, a statesman and cabinet official in both Andrew Jackson's and James Buchanan's administration, argued for voting, sometimes known as popular sovereignty, to determine whether or not there would be slavery in the region. And then there was James C. Calhoun, the famous proponent of states' rights. He called for slavery in that area. But most importantly, what would happen to these Mexicans in this ceded land? Would they become American citizens, foreign immigrants, or neither? This issue continues today as a consequence of the Mexican-American War.
These discussion questions can stimulate thought as a result of the lecture. First of all, was the war just? What about how should the Americans treat Mexicans as a result of the war? Is it fair to set up a boundary as a result of the point of a gun? Or was that just the typical tradition of that time and therefore should be accepted? There are various sources that I want to encourage you to take a look at to formulate your own opinions about our boundaries and connect that with how we should treat immigrants. Two books here that you can see. One is entitled A Wicked War by Amy Greenberg, and another entitled Echoes of the Mexican-American War, which is an editorial piece that gives the American voice on the war as compared to the Mexican voice. So that should be an interesting text to give you a diverse perspective. I hope the takeaways from this lesson will cause you to really think a lot about who does this land really belong to and how should we treat one another as a result of historical context.